honored to introduce our speaker, acclaimed contemporary philosopher, and an esteemed public intellectual, Kwame Anthony Appiah. Professor Appiah has been a guest at Amherst in the past. It's great to welcome you back, Anthony. I hope a lot of you, or at least some of you, have had a chance to interact with him over the past few days. He's the second in the series of presidential scholars who visited this year, and the purpose of the program is to have somebody on campus long enough so that students and faculty and staff who are interested have an opportunity to interact and not only hear one talk, as is frequently the case. So, and you have really been tested, Anthony. Thank you for everything you've done while here. Some of you probably attended or may have listened to the Point Counterpoint session on Thursday evening. That was a very provocative and interesting interaction of Nishi Shah with Adolph Reed and Anthony. As many of you know, but not everyone who's listening or here, Anthony Appiah was born in London. He was educated in Ghana and in England. He has, as many of you know, a distinguished record of scholarship that is unusually wide in its range, including political and moral theory, the philosophy of language and mind, African intellectual history, and the connection between theory and practice in moral life. He's also a novelist, as some of you know, and he's the ethicist of the New York Times Magazine weekly column, Ask the Ethicist, where he offers advice on, again, a very wide range of questions. I have just two examples. Should I help my aging, ailing dad access his toxic web feed? What was the answer to that, Anthony?
Yes.
Yes, And what should I do with my portrait of a slave-holding ancestor? I'm sure your talk will help answer that. Professor Appiah's Cambridge dissertation dealt with issues in the philosophy of language and the philosophy of mind, and it led to two books, Assertion and Conditionals, and For Truth in Semantics. And among more recent books, the widely read, critically acclaimed, and really incredibly influential Cosmopolitanism, Ethics in a World of Strangers. And then Experiments in Ethics, then The Honor Code, How Moral Revolutions Happen, then Lines, W.E.B. Du Bois and the Emergence of Identity, and the rain got my pages together, A Decent Respect, Honor in the Lives of People and Nations, and his most recent book, The Lies That Bind, which I know some of you have read and discussed. It continues a 3-decade-long exploration of the concept of identity and the way it's mobilized in various parts of the world. Anthony Appiah is the recipient of such a long list of honorary degrees and national and international awards and recognition. I'm just going to mention a few. He was named one of the 100 top global thinkers by Foreign Policy magazine. In 2017, he was named a great immigrant by the Carnegie Foundation. He is an elected member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Philosophical Society, the American Academy of Arts and Letters, and others. He has served on the boards of the Pan American Center, the National Humanities Center, the American Academy in Berlin, the Ashesi University College in Accra, Ghana, and the United Nations Democracy Fund. He's been a juror for the Pulitzer Prize, the Bear Green Philosophy Prize, the Man Booker Prize, and in 2012, he was awarded the National Humanities Medal by President Obama. The Getty Foundation awarded him in 2020 the Getty Medal, noting that, and I'm quoting, his writings on culture and identity are of the greatest importance as we confront increasing populism and ethnic nationalism in our daily lives. I don't know who could disagree with that. Please join me in welcoming Anthony Appiah.
Remarks. I think my microphone is now on. All right. I'm very glad to be here again, and I have had a great time with talking to people, faculty, staff, students in the last few days, and I've enjoyed that very much, and I'm looking forward to further conversation this afternoon. So I thought I would today tell a story about racism. This is a topic that I assume interests most people these days, and it's one that has come to be of the greatest salience for us because of events, some of which I'll talk about. And it's an example of a topic on which I think it's helpful to have a kind of philosophical framing, so I'm going to try and do that. But the point of the one story in my title is that I'm not committed to the view that this is the only way to think about this, or even that it's the best possible way to think about it. I just want to tell a story about racism that brings together things that I think are important to understand in thinking about it. So that's the project. So let me begin by saying that if you want to think about racism, it helps to start, I think, with concrete events of the sort that the word evokes. So I've been thinking, as many people have, about sorry, I'm doing this wrong. I've been thinking, as many people have, about the death of the murder of George Floyd and why it was such a galvanizing event. I think that's a good question because it wasn't, after all, unusual for a black man to be killed by an individual American police officer. That happens several times in a typical week. And at current rates, 1 in 1,000 African-American men will die at the hands of the police. Nor was it that a human being was killed by an American police officer. That happens 2 to 3 times on an average day, most commonly with a gun. And I'm sure that the extraordinary circumstances of the pandemic and the moods it has created did play a role in focusing on this particular event, which, as I say, wasn't unfortunately, all that unusual. But what struck me most about it was that the killer could see that he was being recorded. And so it seemed to me that must have been part of why he was doing what he was doing, kneeling on a man's neck. He was sending a message of defiance. So it was directed as much as anything else, I think, at the brave young black woman who was filming him on her phone. And he seemed to be saying, I can do this, you can't stop me. Now you have to situate that air of confidence in the context of the relationship between the American police and the African American community. Half of African Americans of all classes report being discriminated against by the police. If you want to know the figure for whites, do you want to guess what that figure is? 3%. So American police are more likely by far to approach African Americans disrespectfully, to deny them equal treatment and equal dignity. We know this from careful scientific assessments. This one, published in the very prestigious Proceedings of the American National Academy of Sciences. This is an analysis of film from police body cameras, and it noted that there was just a radical difference in the way police, I think they were in Oakland, California, or somewhere in Northern California, approached people after traffic stops if they were black. They just approached them in a different way and with a different level of a lower level of respect than if they were white. And one of the distressing things about this fact is that almost always nothing serious happens to an officer who's found abusing people in our country, actually, whether the people that are abusing are black or white. Indeed, even though American police officers kill hundreds of African Americans a year, there have historically been almost no consequences for the officers who did it, as there have been few consequences for such killings, whatever the race of the victim. in a notorious case in New York City, which began with the asphyxiation and death of Eric Garner, 7 years ago was that. The officer who caused his death was never tried, was fired from his job only 5 years later, even though in an eerie anticipation of George Floyd's murder, Mr. Garner was filmed again, crying, "I can't breathe," and the video was seen by millions. Now, I'm pretty sure that Mr. Floyd's killer didn't think he was being filmed killing a man. What he thought he was doing, and this is something police officers, unfortunately, often do, was humiliating someone. And as I say, he was also showing all the people watching, most of them black, that he had no fear of being penalized for what he was doing, for denying Mr. Floyd the ordinary, decent treatment owed to another human being. It's natural to say that this was racist because we doubt he would have done that in these circumstances to a white person. But that takes us away from things we have much specific evidence about in this case. Even after the trial, we don't know much about the motives of the man who was convicted of this killing. Still, you have to grasp that the disrespect and the expectation that he would get away with it, as I say, they're not abnormal. They're part of the normal relationship between the American police and black people. Now, I'm not saying that most police officers do things like this. Obviously, they don't. It often turns out that the officers whose bad behavior catches media attention comes from a minority with a particularly bad record of civilian complaints. That was true of George Floyd's killer, and it was true of the New York police officer who killed Eric Garner. But it is true that most police officers who witness this sort of behavior don't do anything about it. They don't try to stop it, and then the system goes through the motions of looking into it, but almost always in the end does nothing. Given that this ends up harming black and brown people at a much higher rate than whites, some people say that the system is racist. I said you might think that the original act looked racist, but now it's natural, thinking about in which people respond to such acts, the system, the official state responds to such acts, to think that there's something racist about the system. So I think it's natural to say that what we were witnessing here was racism in action. Yet, 2 of the 4 police officers in the Floyd case were not white. In cases like this, it can help to do what philosophers do. Think carefully about concepts like racism, and so help all of us think about these issues with greater care. Our media, and especially our social media, are full of accusations of racism of this sort, but I think it's fair to say that there isn't a consensus on a definition of the term. And that disagreement about definitions can turn into disagreement about cases. Some might say, some have said, that the involvement of non-white officers in the episode here is evidence that this wasn't racism. Others might object to my speaking of a racist system at all. I think that's what some of the people who don't like talk of critical race theory don't like. They don't like the idea that there might be something systematically racist about the institutions of the United States. And those people are inclined to say things like, only people can be racist. And without a clear account of what racism is, these debates aren't likely to make much progress. Now, you might think that doesn't matter very much. What matters is not what we call these things, you might say, but what matters is figuring out what's right and wrong. Racist or not, killing George Floyd was wrong. You don't have to need to know that it was racist to know that it was wrong. Police officers shouldn't behave in ways that lead to the death of people like that. But that doesn't seem to me quite right. I mean, of course, it's obvious that it was wrong. You didn't need to know that it was racist. It was wrong. You could have come from Mars and seen that it was wrong without knowing anything about racism. But it seems to me important to get right that it was not just a bad thing, but a racist thing. Why? Well, first, because in morality, we need to know what someone was thinking in order to decide how wrong their act was, whether there are excuses or mitigating factors and the like. In criminal law classes, they talk about mens rea, guilty mind. And in order to decide whether someone has a guilty mind, you have to know something about what's going on in their mind. If I drove my car over someone with the aim of killing them, That's wrong in a different way from doing it through what we call vehicular negligence. There's a different thing going on in my mind when I kill someone by mistake from what's going on when I do it with intention. And normally, other things being equal, the former, the intentional act, will deserve greater condemnation and greater punishment than the latter. And if the thoughts that guided the thinking of the killer of George Floyd were racist, and racism is a vice, then that makes his act worse, more culpable, more worthy of greater punishment. It may also be worthy of special punishment for other reasons. Maybe we think that the existence in our society of people with racist motives means that we need to raise the penalty for punishment to achieve effective deterrence of racist acts. Someone who's willing to risk probation and a fine in order to beat up a person of another race might not be willing to risk imprisonment. So we might adjust the penalty for that reason. But in order to do that, we have to be attentive to what the motives are of the person doing it. But second, it may be that a deeper understanding of racism will allow us to identify what's wrong with it and what we need to do to eradicate it. Without a clearer picture of the wrong in racism, we may not put the right focus in our attempts to put it right. There's a third reason that we might want to have an account of what racism is. Without that account, we won't be able to distinguish it from other things. And some of those things, unlike racism, may not be wrong at all. I think, for example, that some forms of what's called affirmative action are worthy attempts to respond to injustice. But if you have the wrong understanding of racism, you may think that that can't be so, because you think racism is treating people of different races differently, and so affirmative action is racist. And so, since racism is wrong, affirmative action is wrong. So you need the right account of racism in order to distinguish it from other things, some of which aren't even wrong. Finally, as we'll see, at least when it comes to dealing with the racism not of systems but of individuals, it will be helpful to disentangle different ways in which people's behavior can be shaped by racial attitudes and beliefs. Some of these attitudes may be mistaken without being immoral. That's important because one thing that almost everyone agrees about, and this is implicit in everything I've said so far, is that racism, whatever it is wrong, and that racist acts are the acts of wrongdoers. But people can be mistaken without being bad. Not every mistake people make about race should count as racism, and people shouldn't be blamed for being racist unless their racial attitudes involve some kind of specifically moral mistake. Okay, so how should we begin to sort out these issues? The object isn't to track how ordinary people use some word. So this is not lexicography. I'm not saying what it should say in the dictionary about racism, though that's a difficult and important question, and I respect the lexicographers who try. The idea instead is to give an illuminating picture of an important set of connected wrongs. And so I suggest we start with the fact that racism, whatever it is morally wrong, but proceed to give a richer picture. Now, every serious person knows that in our country and our world, there are practices and attitudes that end up treating people in ways they ought not to be treated because of their race. That's the suspicion that guided many of our responses to the death of George Floyd. We need a way of talking about that fact. Even if some people did use the word racism to describe something they thought was morally okay, we need a way of talking about practice and institutions and beliefs about race that are not okay. Most of us already use the word racism that way. Hardly anybody says seriously, that's racist, and what's wrong with that? And one test of our account of the nature of racism, for me, is going to be that it should help us understand not just that racism is wrong, but why. That would be more illuminating than just a dictionary answer. Be to try and figure out, give an account of what racism is and explains what's wrong with it. And I should add that for the story to be plausible, there'd better be some core things that are racist and not just wrong, but seriously wrong. That is to say, racism isn't just wrong, it's a serious wrong in our world. And an account that failed to grasp that would, I think, be an inadequate account.
My second assumption is that racism should have something to do with attitudes and behavior that are in response to people's actual or supposed race. You might think that isn't worth saying, but there are other things like racism, sexism, Islamophobia, xenophobia, homophobia, for example. And one thing that distinguishes them is the fact that they're grounded in different things, and race is grounded in beliefs and attitudes towards people on the basis of their supposed race. Whereas, of course, sexism is based on gender, Islamophobia is based on religion, xenophobia is based on national origin, and homophobia is based on attitudes to people in virtue of their sexual orientation. This might seem obvious, but it raises a difficulty because it follows that racism presupposes a belief in races, and many modern scientists, biologists, anthropologists, and sociologists think that the belief in races that underlies most racism is itself an intellectual mistake. I'll get back to saying what I think that mistake is in a minute. And while intellectual errors are sometimes the result of morally bad acts, such as ignoring evidence that you ought to be paying attention to, or character vices, such as intellectual laziness or prejudice, having a false belief is not in itself automatically morally wrong. It's obviously cognitively wrong, but it's not, there's something wrong with it, but it isn't always a moral wrong. These two assumptions already have an important consequence. If belief in races can be a purely intellectual error and not a moral one, and if racism is a moral error, then racism must be more than belief in races. My final assumption is that the word racism should cover not just people who are racists, but systems of ideas, practices, attitudes, and beliefs, as well as institutions. What the connections between the different elements of these systems is something that we'll need to explore. But after thinking about these things for many years, I'm convinced that there's a good reason why we use the word racist to talk about so many different things. Putting here will be whether an account that covers them all can seem both plausible and illuminating. So with these constraints in mind, I want to begin to tell you my story of what racism is and why it's wrong. Most people don't know that the word racism came into common use in English in the 1930s to refer to the ideas of European fascist political parties. One thing fascists in Europe believed in was a nationalist politics organized around the distinction between one race that properly belonged on the national territory and whose interests the nation-state should serve, on the one hand, and other, supposedly inferior races, Jews, Roma, Slavs, Negroes, Asians, who were to be expelled, or in the worst case, as with Nazism, exterminated. But the identification of the nation with a group of people with a common ancestry and inherited biological character was something that had occurred increasingly over the course of the 19th century, as the new science of biology was growing in prestige. The word biology is actually coined in 1800, so it's a 19th century idea, the idea of biology. I mean, it was coined in German, so it was Biologie, but I mean, the first use of that word is in the 19th century. So let me take up the story with an address to the nations of the world at the first Pan-African Conference in London, given by the greatest African-American intellectual of the 20th century, W.B. Du Bois. In that talk, Dr. Du Bois proclaimed that the problem of the 20th century was the problem of the color line. The question, he said, this is a photograph of the typescript of that actual talk, the question as to how far differences of race, which show themselves chiefly in the skin and color of the skin and the texture of the hair, have to be made the basis of denying to over half the world the right of sharing to their utmost ability the opportunities and privileges of modern civilization. So Du Bois believed, correctly as it turned out, that combating white supremacy would be a major challenge in the politics of the century to come. And when he said that race was to be the problem of the 20th century, he didn't just mean in his own country, the United States, and he didn't just mean for his own, as he would have said, Negro people. He saw the color line as a battle on two fronts, challenging the mistreatment of non-white people in Europe and the Americas on the one hand, and defeating European colonial empires on the other. That's why he was talking, as he said, about over half the world. Elsewhere in the speech, he spoke not just of the millions of black men in Africa, America, and the islands of the sea, but of the brown and yellow myriads elsewhere. He had a lovely turn of phrase, did Dr. Du Bois. So Dr. Du Bois, in 1900, had very much in mind the ways in which race figured in the European colonial schemes that were reshaping Africa and Asia, as well as its role in the American social injustices he had experienced at first hand. Civic and economic inequality between races and ethnicities, whether produced by government policy, by private discrimination, or by the very complex interactions between both of those things, were pervasive features of states at the start of the 20th century, and they remain so long after that Pan-African conference was but a distant memory. All around the world, people know of the struggle of African Americans and of South Africa's non-white populations for racial equality. But political struggles over racial inequality have been central in the politics of Australia, New Zealand, most of the other countries of the Americas as well, whether the racial groups seeking justice were First Peoples, or the descendants of African slaves, or of South or East Asian indentured laborers. And this too was part of what Du Bois had in mind. He was very cosmopolitan in his conception of what the problem of the 20th century was. Now, over time, as non-Europeans, including many citizens of Europe's former empires in Asia and Europe and Africa, have migrated into Europe in increasing numbers, questions of racial inequality in rights, in education, employment and housing, and in income and wealth have come to the fore in Europe too. Disparities around race. Racial discrimination and insult remain a global phenomenon. And a good part of why this is seriously wrong is because these attitudes lead to suffering and death on a global scale for the victims of these racial attitudes. What is at the heart of these problems then? Well, one thing, as we've seen, is belief in races. But the problem isn't just the thought that you can classify people into a set of mutually exclusive groups on the basis of genes or some other biological feature that people have because they belong to groups of common ancestry. That turns out to be false, because human beings didn't just spread out into the world from Africa. There were also frequent reversals of the flow, as with the migrations of Arabs out of Arabia with the rise of Islam, or the earlier movement west of the Huns under Attila in the 5th century. Or more to the point here, the arrival, so that's on the left is the Arab expansion, on the right is the travels of the Huns. Notice that's in the opposite direction from out of Africa, so that's part of the point I'm making. And of course, more to the point here in the United States, the arrival through the slave trade of something like 11 million Africans who survived the Middle Passage to get to the New World. Much more human mixture as a result of the many global migrations of modern times, of Europeans to the New World and Australasia, of Indian indentured laborers and merchants within the circuits of the British Empire, to Mr. Babu in Ghana, in my hometown, was an Indian traveling through the circuits of the British Empire. Guyana has had prime ministers of Indian descent because of the migration of indentured laborers into the Caribbean, and so on. Now, and of course, there are enormously important circulations of other groups, Chinese people into Southeast Asia and so on. Again, huge migrations, which explain things like the majority Chinese population of the small city-state of Singapore. When people travel, they mix. They don't stay totally separate, either culturally or biologically, from the populations they meet. And that's been going on not just since 1492, but for hundreds and thousands and tens of thousands of years. So because of that, you can't draw sharp boundaries between human populations, and the idea or the underlying thought of these good. Now, The real intellectual error, however, in the kind of belief in races that underlies the sorts of horrors that Du Bois was talking about under his catchphrase of the color line, wasn't just thinking you could divide the humans into biological species, biological subspecies or groups. It was something much more substantial. I'm going to call it racialism, the belief that there are inherited racial essences which determine and explain not just obvious physical traits like skin color and hair, the ones that Du Bois mentioned, shape of the eyes and the nose and so on, but other non-physical traits, including in particular moral and intellectual ones. This is a stipulative definition of, that's what I'm going to mean by racialism. I don't mean that that's what it should say in the dictionary. This is the sort of thing you hear when people say that Jews or Gujaratis are just naturally good at business. Or when, in more intellectual circles, the great British literary critic Matthew Arnold said about the Celts, the Welsh and Irish of the British Isles, that they were sentimental, I'm quoting from Matthew Arnold, if the Celtic nature is to be characterized by a single term. That is the best term to take. Because this, and this is, by the way, in the lectures on Celtic poetry, which he gave as professor of poetry at Oxford, which is one of the few professorships at Oxford that is an elected position, so you have to campaign for it. It's a fascinating thing because it's a book that these essays are deeply. I mean, he's interested in Celtic literature because he thinks it's important and splendid, but his account of who the Celts are and why their poetry is the way it is extremely racialist. It's the sentimental character of the Celtic people that produces the sentimental character of the verse that is uttered at Welsh bardic festivals, Eisteddfods, and so on. All right, so because the idea is associated with belief in some inner property, an essence, that is present in all and only the members of that race and explains not just their physical but their moral and intellectual character, it leads people very often to assume that members of a race must have more in common than they actually do, and to suppose as well, also wrongly, that the character of individual members of a group is to be explained not by something more specific to them, but by something they share with everybody in their race. Now, because I think racialism is false, and I don't know any serious modern person who thinks it's true, I need either to say that there are no races, if that's what they're supposed to be, or to give an account, an alternative account, of what they are, a non-racialist account. And I propose we say that racial groups, like many other groups in society, are people who share, like people who share a gender, or a class, or a religion, or a nationality, and so on. And essentialism is not a very good idea. Racialism is essentialism about races, but essentialism is not a very good idea about gender, or class, or religion, or nationality either. And there are three significant things that these very disparate... Sorry, there's Matthew Arnold talking about the sentimentality of the Celts. There are three significant things that these very disparate forms of grouping people, race, gender, class, religion, nationality, have in common. That they come with labels. So understanding identities requires first that you have some idea about how to apply them. That way, you could look for someone of that identity or try to decide when you meet someone whether the label applies. Often people disagree about the boundaries here. Is a white Spaniard Hispanic? But there's some, usually, consensus about central cases. A second point is that membership in an identity group matters for the emotions and the deeds of members of the group. They identify. And so it creates what you could call, what I have called norms of identification, ideas about how you should behave given your identity. So people sometimes do things because they're black, or because they're an American, or because they're a woman, or because they're gay, or because they're a Catholic. It creates, that is their reason, is that they're Catholic. It plays a role in their thinking about what they're doing, not just in thinking of other people. And one of the commonest ways in which identification matters is that it leads people to feel solidarity with other members of the group. That's one of the positive possibilities of identity. So that is, their common identity gives them reason, they think, to care about and help one another. But just as there's usually conflict or contest about the boundaries of the group, about who's in and who's out, there's almost always disagreement about what normative significance an identity has. What does being an American require of you? Even in this, no doubt, moderately intellectually homogeneous room, I doubt that we could get an agreement on that question. And the third thing, of course, that all identities share is that they don't just give you reasons to do things, they give other people reasons to do things to you. People treat you as men, women, gay, straight, American, Chinese, black, white, Asian, Hispanic. And again, I've already mentioned something that affects how people treat people. It's when someone acts in solidarity with you as a member of a certain identity group, they're treating you in a certain way because of your identity. They're acting in a certain way because of their identity, but they're treating you in a certain way because of your identity. So both identification and treatment matter. And of course, among the most significant things that people do with identities is not the solidaristic thing, it's using them as the basis of hierarchies of status and respect and of structures of power and domination. In many places in the world, one ethnic or racial group regards its members as superior to others and assumes the right to better treatment. And of course, attitudes like these look like they're at the heart of racism. So to summarize all this in just in this brief formula, identities come with labels and ideas about whom the labels should be applied to. Identities shape thoughts about how you should behave, and they affect the way other people treat you. And all dimensions of identity are contestable. They're up for dispute, who's in, what they're like, and how they should behave and how they should be treated. And because of these disputes, it can, among other things, be unclear whether someone has a certain racial identity. Which of these people, the parents of my favorite recent president and the president himself, which of these people is black? I mean, President Obama was born in the United States. Hesitate to make such a controversial claim. But he had a Kenyan father, and his mother was a white woman born in Kansas. So is he really African American, or shouldn't he be described as mixed race? Well, the key thing for our purposes is that if someone treats Barack Obama wrongly because they think of him as black, then that will be racist, whether or not he really is black. Who cares whether he's black in deciding whether that's racist treatment? What matters is that he was treated as black. And from now on, and by the way, just in case you think I think Barack Obama is black, because he thinks he's black, and that matters to him. And it seems in general to be respectful to treat people as having the identities that they claim for themselves, as long as they have some plausible basis for that claim, and he does. But racialism in itself isn't a moral problem. It's an intellectual mistake. The hierarchical stuff is a moral mistake, but the belief in races, which I mentioned as the essence of racialism, isn't. It can have terrible effects because very often part of what racialists believe, this is not part of the definition of racism, but part of what they actually believe is that their own race is superior in some way to other races, and that people of other races are therefore less worthy. Now, I once called this belief in the unworthiness of people of a race extrinsic racism. It's extrinsic because you think that it just happens to be true that they're unworthy, because they have traits that would be unworthy in anyone. So the badness of black people or of Chinese people or of Jews is because they have properties that are bad properties. It's not that, and so it's not a prejudice, it's just, well, there they are, they have these bad properties. I'm inclined now to think that that was a bad idea to talk about extrinsic racism, because though extrinsic racism is usually false, it's not necessarily morally wrong. And I said we should keep the term racism for wrongs. So I'm going to call it negative racialism instead, because the point is it's having negative beliefs about a racial group. But you might have reasons for those negative beliefs. They're not likely to be true, but that doesn't mean you can't have reasons for them. And then that's an intellectual mistake, but it's not yet a moral one. Now, sometimes people just believe these things because they've been brought up to believe them. And then once you show them that they're false, they give them up. Still, as we'll see, these beliefs could be the result of a wrong, even if it's not the fault of the people who have them. So negative racialism can be, as we'll see, a consequence of racist institutions. But even if these negative racialist beliefs are not always morally wrong, they can still have two kinds of bad effects. One is stereotyping, which involves not paying attention to the individual person in front of you and assessing how you treat them on the basis not of their own character and behavior, but on the basis of your beliefs about the group to which they belong. You can have plenty of evidence that someone of another race is honest and still treat them as if they were dishonest, suspecting that it must be that they stole something that you can't find, for example, because you think of dishonesty as a trait of their race. This is something that happened very often in the colonial context. That can lead to a second bad effect, treating people in a way that they don't deserve to be treated, as in this case, when someone might be fired or arrested for something they didn't do. Now, the mistakes that people make in this way, because they're racialists, can be corrected, if they're open-minded, by asking them to look properly at the evidence. One of Du Bois's projects throughout his life was to try to edit an encyclopedia of the black world that would demonstrate that many of the negative things people believed about black people were false. Eventually, though, he gave up thinking that. Here's one reason. Negative racialism is often the result of something else, which is something that I once named intrinsic racism. This is a matter of thinking that people of some race aren't entitled to the same decent treatment due to people of your race, simply because they are of a different race. Some people just think their own race is intrinsically more worthy. It may be that someone of another race has nothing especially wrong with them. They're not individually stupid or dishonest or oversexed or lazy. Look down on. But that doesn't matter. The intrinsic racist thinks it's okay to treat that individual, the individual who is clean and lazy and moderately sexed, badly, or at least not well, because they're not of their own race. So here, but the beliefs, once you have that attitude to people of a certain race, negative racialism is quite likely to become part of the package of your attitudes. That's because once you have a negative attitude to a group, you're more likely to believe bad things about them. More than that, you'll often express negative racialist ideas about people because they provide a rationalization for your bad treatment of them. It's easier to say that blacks are lazy and stupid or that Jews are scheming and clannish than to say, I don't like blacks, I don't like Jews. Gets at a third element of the package of individual racism, because so far I've been talking about beliefs, propositions that people can hold to be true. But racism is also about feelings. People can have hatred or contempt for other people on the grounds of their racial identity without its being grounded in any particular beliefs about what they're like. Racism has an emotional component, individual racism. Once people are intrinsic racists, they are quite likely to have not just false beliefs about other races, but irrational ones. They won't be any good at assessing the evidence about those other races because their prejudices lead them to be incapable of looking at them, as it were, with a clear eye. Worse, those irrational beliefs will be motivated. They'll be easy to hold on to because they work to the advantage of the racist and the group to which the racist belongs. Many of us just find it hard, this is not a point about racists in particular, many find it hard to give up beliefs that play a part in justifying the special advantages we gain or hope to gain from our position in the social order, and in particular, beliefs about the positive character of the class of people who share our position are among the things that we naturally slip into unless we check ourselves and ask ourselves whether that isn't just prejudice. Why are people sometimes like this? Well, one reason is just the basic us-them feelings of intergroup psychology. Once we have social groups, they turn into in-groups and out-groups, and we favor our own kind. Evolutionary psychologists think that these tendencies are built into us because people who are like this create groups that survive better in the sort of intergroup competition for resources that was the context of earlier human evolution. That's one reason why there are, as I said earlier, so many things of this kind, so many what you might call allophobias, phobias against people not us, racism, Islamophobia, religious bigotry, and so on. But I think there's a deeper explanation for why this sort of package comes together in people in so many societies, and it's not psychological, it's sociological. It's not a matter of individual thoughts and feelings, but of social structures. People who have these elements of the individual racism package will end up acting together to maintain social advantages for people of their own racial identity. And because negative racialism provides a rationalization for the bad treatment of the less favored races, they will be more comfortable doing so. Often, their religious traditions, unfortunately, will support them in this, so that it will seem to them that God is on the side of the supremacy of their own race. As a judge in the state of Virginia, considering in 1964 an ACLU motion to vacate the one-year sentence on Mildred Jeter and Richard Loving for miscegenation in 1959, put it like this: Almighty God this is in 1960s, an American judge in an American court. Almighty God created the races white, black, yellow, Malay, and red, and he placed them on separate continents. Nobody from the ACLU said Malaysia isn't a continent. But anyway, for the interference with his arrangement, there would be no cause for such marriages. The fact that he separated the races shows that he did not intend for the races to mix. Now, as I argued, a brief scan of human history suggests that this judge is wrong about what God was up to, because people have been moving around a good deal and mixing all along. But just remember that this was a judge in an American courtroom speaking during the Johnson administration. And his decision meant that President Obama's parents had a marriage that was a crime, punishment by imprisonment in Virginia, until the president was 6 years old. Now, there is a philosopher's way, I think, of seeing this package, not as something that just happens to come together by chance, but as the result of a pervasive system of ideas maintained in place by the fact that it serves certain interests. Philosophers in the Marxist tradition have used the word ideology in this way for more than a century. Ideologies in this sense, as the philosopher Tommy Shelby has written, are, quote, widely accepted illusory systems of belief that function to establish or reinforce structures of social oppression. And I think it helps to think of racism, as Shelby does, as an ideology, a system of illusory ideas, like racialism, that play a role in racial oppression. That, you'll recall, racialism meant belief in the biological reality of races with essential properties. That ideology leads people to have both negative attitudes and false beliefs about people of their own and other races. Some of these attitudes are vices, the opposite of virtues. It's morally okay to resent someone who has wronged you. It's morally okay to disapprove of someone who's done something wrong, even if you weren't the victim. But it's a vice to hate or dislike or disrespect someone for no good reason. That's a moral vice. And being of another racial identity isn't a morally sufficient reason to fail to respect someone. Now, the point about ideologies is that they aren't kept in place simply by chance. There are institutions, courts in the state of Virginia, for example, schools and colleges, for example, that kept racist ideology in place for a very long time in our country. And there were government practices that helped to keep them in place as well. The most obvious, of course, of these is segregation, which made it easier for people to have false beliefs about other races because it kept the races apart in the kinds of social life in which you learn about other people. And it stopped people forming warm feelings for them. The sort of warm feelings, again, people develop when they live and work side by side on terms of equality. So what makes these institutions racist is precisely that they serve to sustain and transmit the ideology, the system of ideas, and that, as we have seen, helps perpetuate the individual beliefs and the individual feelings that make individual people racist. So racism is an ideology whose effect is to oppress people of one racial identity or maintain unjust advantages for those of another. Institutions are racist if they help sustain the ideology, and the ideology has the effect of sustaining the packages of beliefs and feelings that make individuals racist. So, is that the fundamental wrong in racism is the oppression of one racial group to the people of one racial identity to the advantage of another. What makes people, beliefs, feelings, institutions, and practices racist is that they contribute to that wrong. Because negative racialist beliefs need not be the fault of the people who have them, it turns out that you can have a racist belief that it's a bad thing to have, but for which you are not to blame. It's wrong, but it's not, so to speak, you're wrong. There are different forms of racism in different places with different histories. Anti-black racism developed in the Atlantic world with the rise of the slave trade. Its effect was to rationalize the appalling treatment of black people involved in the Middle Passage and the practice of enslavement, as well as to defend colonial empires. It led to a system of white supremacy, where the least advantaged white person had a kind of superior status to any black person. When slavery ended, the advantages that it had generated for white people were substituted for with the system of Jim Crow that developed with the end of Reconstruction and its northern analogues. Let's not forget that racism isn't something that happens in the South. We are still living with the legacies of that white supremacy. So now we have an account that does, as you'll be unsurprised to learn, all the things I said we did at the start. It says what racism is, and it tells us what we can do about it. It doesn't always blame individual people for contributing to racism because it sees racist attitudes as something produced by the institutions that sustain racist ideology. It tells us that racism is morally wrong and why, and it shows why it's possible not just for people but also for statements, attitudes, acts, and institutions to be racist. It explains how attitudes and behavior and institutions and practices that are in some way grounded in the race of the people who are its victims, their racial identities, can come together to wrong people by subjecting them to racial oppression. As we come to a conclusion, let me quickly sketch some consequences of this story. Notice first that this means that if favoring your own race doesn't contribute to sustaining racial oppression, it won't be racist. And that is why it seems to me that racial solidarity among African Americans, given the history of white supremacy, is not a kind of racist ideology, and that the attitudes it produces are therefore not racist, or don't have to be. That does not, of course, mean wrong, including morally wrong. Hostility to people of a particular race can be wrong, even if it's not racist. Similarly, because the fundamental wrong in racism is racial oppression, affirmative action is not going to count as racist unless it contributes to racial oppression. And in the present circumstances of the United States, I think it would be hard to make the case that that was true. But I do think that the way in which some affirmative action has actually been carried out may have contributed to the class oppression of some white people. And to the extent that is true, it is wrong not because it's racist, but because it's classist, where classism is an ideology designed to oppress a subordinate class or classes, just as racism subordinates and oppresses people on account of their racial identities. Now, you might think that the trouble caused by this racist ideology over the long life of this republic could be made to disappear if we all stopped thinking of ourselves in racial terms altogether. Black consciousness can be enlisted in the struggle against racism, and it wouldn't be so obviously attractive if we could get rid of racism. And white consciousness too often does operate in the service of racism. Thinking of yourself as white can make you give unjust advantages to other white people. It can do that through unconscious mechanisms, in particular, that you yourself don't notice. There are good reasons for white people to want to abandon whiteness, because the category white was developed in large measure to deny social and political equality to black people. Identifying with that category can seem to put you in the business of maintaining white supremacy. And so many anti-racist people, mindful of this troubled history, have indeed called for white identity to be disowned or abolished. But alas, it is not up to us to determine the meanings of racial terms. What he avowed in Through the Looking Glass, it means what I choose it to mean, neither more or less. As he said, the question is, who is to be master? But Mr. Dumpty was right to pose the question, but wrong to claim that he himself could simply choose to be the master of our common language. It's not only our language, but all our social practices that we build in common. This really must be done by what in America we call we the people, acting together. What white means in America, like what black means, isn't up to each of us to decide on our own. To change those meanings, we'd have to work together to change practices. If you don't want to be white because you repudiate white supremacy or the racialization of public life, you have first to work alongside others to remake an unjust social order. You can't simply declare yourself out of the game. Adrian Piper, who's a very distinguished African-American artist and also philosopher, she's a Kant scholar and with a PhD from Harvard, told a friend of mine the other day, and she now lives in Berlin, and she told this friend the other day that she said, I have retired from race. But you can't. I mean, we could all retire from race if we did it together, but you can't retire from race on your own. So although many, many white people clearly disapprove of the privilege that comes with white skin in our society, refusing to call yourself white won't increase the chance that you'll be discriminated against or decrease the chance that any black person will be discriminated against. So being white is not a matter just of what you think. It involves being treated as white, and that isn't up to you. So however you think of yourself, your whiteness is going to be doing work in social life. So I think there's something to be said for white people accepting that they're white, whether they like it or not, because they can use their whiteness as an instrument of anti-racism. So here's one usable kind of privilege that white people have in our society. When you, as a white person, point to acts of anti-black racism, you're less likely than a black person to be suspected of being hypersensitive or self-interested. You can also speak up in all white settings when people venture anti-black remarks, which a black person can't do because they won't be made in many contexts if they're there. Once we see what racism is, we can be clear that we want to bring it to an end. Given its pervasiveness, that's going to take a while. But at least, once we're clear about what it is, we can set about that task, acting, all of us, whatever our racial identities, in a concerted program to dismantle the racism that has so poisoned the history of this republic of ours. And if you want to say what it is we're dismantling, it's a racist ideology in our country and elsewhere that serves to oppress people of black identity, in part by creating people who are individually racist. And the fundamental wrong in racism is its role in the oppression of people of one or other racial identity. Thank you. Maybe we could turn the lights up a bit. I don't know. Yes, thank you. Questions, please. Yes. I mean, I said this is one story, so I imagine there are other stories. Sure. There's a microphone, because there are people listening online, so if you don't go to the microphone, they won't hear you.
Okay, is this working?
Yes.
Awesome. I don't have a background in philosophy or ethics, and I'm curious what you mean when you say that the belief in racialism is an intellectual mistake, but not necessarily a moral wrong. Could you just go through that a little bit?
Sure. So, suppose you went to Oxford when Matthew Arnold was professor of poetry. All the lectures you heard on almost every topic in the humanities would have assumed that the world was full of races and that the history of the world was the history of races. And you would have been taught that the Celts were sentimental, that black people were less capable intellectually, and so on. You would have, and it's not a bad habit to be inclined to believe the things that are told to you by professors at distinguished institutions. That in itself is not a mistake. So you end up believing these things. And you haven't so far yet done anything wrong, right? You've got these, what I was calling racialist beliefs, but they've been instituted in you in the way in which your true beliefs were instituted in you, by being told to you by reliable authorities whom you believed and had reason to trust. So at that point, if that's the state of your mind, I don't think there's any point in blaming you for having those views. Nevertheless, they are racist in effect, and the institution that is producing them in you is a racist institution because it's perpetuating an ideology which is serving the purpose of continuing racial oppression. In that case, more in relation to the colonial empires of the United Kingdom than in relation to the treatment of black people in England, of whom there were some, but not very many. So when, at about the same time as Matthew Arnold said that, John Stuart Mill, who normally is a hero of mine, said about the people of India that they were in their nonage, which means that they were not yet mature, they were children. And John Stuart Mill worked at the India office. That was his day job, was managing India. That was racism, racist ideology in action, shaping the behavior of an otherwise decent person in relation to his thinking about India, and his thinking about India was non-trivially important because he was involved in the management of India. He wasn't just someone sitting back and reading the newspaper about India. He was writing memory to Indians. So that's what I meant. You can be, and if that's your experience, if you heard Matthew Arnold's lectures on Celtic poetry, it might take you a while, once somebody challenged you, to come round to the view that maybe he was wrong. All right? So you can't expect people just to respond to who've been raised with these beliefs, to respond immediately when you say, I've done a sociological study that shows that whatever, there are many poor Jews in Germany. Did you know that? Said to a Nazi, doesn't do much good to begin with. It might eventually be part of the story of getting someone to alter their frame of mind, but to begin with, it's not going to be much help. So that's the thought. The thought is that, now, I also said that there are ways of getting beliefs that can be the result of things that are wrong. So, if you're a police officer, it's your duty to attend to the evidence about the culpability of each person you interact with as a police officer. And if you fail to do that, you can come to have false beliefs about what they've done, and those false beliefs are culpable not because it's culpable to hold the belief, but because it was culpable not to have paid attention to the evidence informing the belief. So there are ways in which beliefs can be morally infected. But if the reason you believe something is just because your daddy said so, that's normally speaking a goodish reason to believe things. And it's not someone who refuses, and just to sort of, as it were, underline the point, the only reason we are, at least by certain standards, the most successful species on this planet is because we learn things from each other. Because we come to form beliefs on the basis of trust. If you had to check every belief that in order to decide whether you should believe it on the basis of evidence available to you, we'd still be living in the Stone Age, right? It's only because people could accumulate knowledge without checking it that they could build pyramids, right? No individual is going to be able to put a pyramid together all by themselves without relying on information from other people. And relying on means taking it on trust, not having to check it. You and I have huge structures of belief, the vast majority of which we acquired by testimony, not by direct evidence. And that's what's so great about us. That's why it's also what's so terrible about us, because, Fox News may be your source of information. And you can be abused by liars and the ignorant and the foolish and the wicked by their giving you beliefs that you trust, which turn out to be mistaken. And maybe not just turn out to be, which they give you because they're mistaken, and they want you to have mistaken beliefs, right? So, is that clearer? Good. No, thank you. No other. How about just straight up disagreements with something I said? Or maybe enthusiastic endorsements of something I said. I don't know. Yes. Ah, good. Thank you, my friend.
So good to see you again. I just want to offer up two other things that I want to hear you
Okay.
address.
Good.
One is colorism,
Yes.
and the other is I'm wondering how this fits into Isabel Wilkerson's thought around caste. So can you tackle
Sure.
those two for us? Thank you.
Sure. Colorism is an interesting phenomenon because if you talk about colorism in the context of African American studies, people tend to think of it as an American thing. But of course, I mean, I know you don't think that, but it's an interesting global effect of racism that it's turned blackness into a negative thing for some black people, right? And that shows up in institutions like, I don't know, the brown bag clubs in, nightclubs and so on in black communities where you have to be lighter than a brown bag in order to get in, right? I know white people don't know about this, but anyway, that's a thing that happens. And you see it in Ghana, where I grew up. There are women who whiten their skin using chemicals, and that's definitely not traditional. And the idea that people with very dark skin are less attractive is not part of the traditional repertory of beliefs in Asante, say. So it's connected with the importation of racist thinking in the colonial period into those societies, and colorism among African Americans is presumably connected with having spent several centuries in an anti-black society. So I think it was important for black consciousness movements starting in the 60s to say black is beautiful and mean dark black is beautiful, not just mean being African American is beautiful, which they also thought. But that there was nothing, that far from it being the case, as it were, that being very dark skinned counted against your being attractive, it actually counted in favor of the possibility of being attractive. So these are the sort of cultural, this is the sort of cultural work that we have to do to undo centuries of racism. And this comes because, these ideas about what's beautiful are, of course, reinforced by what you see in art museums, what you see in movies, what you read in books, descriptions of beautiful people, her lovely fair skin, that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of clearing to be done. There's a lot of, and I think that's why we have to think of the problem as systemic, right? It's not just that a bunch of individual people have beliefs that are unfortunate. The system is producing and reproducing those beliefs, and it will do so until we make a conscious effort to stop. So I think colorism is a good example of something where it's one of the damages of racism. It undermines the self-respect of some part of the black community. And that, of course, people who are lacking in self-respect are more repressible, and so it contributes to the overall wrong of social oppression on the basis of racial identity. And notice that it's something that's in the minds of black people, right? So it's in the minds of black people. It's not all the harms of racism are in the minds of racists. And the second question was about caste. Yes. Right. So, as you know, but perhaps not everybody does, like all communities in the United States, the African-American community has a class structure, has a set of status hierarchies, and not just in the United States, I should say, in the world. And in the United States, one kind of status hierarchy was organized around color, and there was a kind of, light-skinned, possibly even at the top, able to pass group of African Americans. And while there wasn't a sharp, a fixed mapping of status into color, because it's more complicated than that, still, as it were, the higher you go, the lighter you get, sort of thing. Or the lighter you are, the higher you go, or something like that. That's very like caste, right? So in India, the lower castes are associated with blackness, and the higher upper castes are associated with lighter skin. But there are very dark-skinned Brahmins, and there are light-skinned Dalits. So it's a symbolic association of status with color, but it's not a literal mapping of status into color. So that's one of the ways in which race and caste are similar in the race in the United States is similar to caste in India. However, one of the and that has been one of the dominant streams of American sociological reflection on race. Is to take caste, which was an obvious, as it were, model, and to use it to think about race in America, to think about the parallels between caste, including the fact that caste is a quasi-religious set of hierarchies, and in America, religion, as I mentioned, played a central role in stories about religion, and everything from the Curse of Ham to all sorts of stuff like that played a role in the ideology of American racism. Her thought that that's an illuminating parallel is sort of one of the founding thoughts of American sociology of race, and the earliest of the African Americans who did sociology, including some she talks about in the book, the Davises, for example, explored that analogy. An analogy is a parallelism that's hopefully illuminating, but all analogies have features that are imperfect, and they could be used in ways that are unilluminating as well. I guess one of the things that I felt about that book, and I wrote a New York Times review of that book, so if you want to know everything I thought about it, you can read it there. But one of the things I thought about that book was that it was that she should have spent more time listening to Adolph Reed, that there wasn't enough about the fact that the most serious problem of racial injustice in the United States isn't that Isabel Wilkerson gets treated badly when she's sitting in the first class of an American airplane. That is racist. It is part of the system of racial oppression, but I don't know how big a part it should play in our thinking about it. Big things that she doesn't say much about. And again, with Dalits, it's not, the main problem for Dalits isn't that people won't marry them. It's that they don't get good jobs. And they have to wait in line indefinitely at the post office and all that stuff that we know from racism in the United States. So that was my anxiety about the book, was that it was a bit classist is a bit strong, but it was not sufficiently attentive, I thought, to the ways in which race does material harm as well as symbolic harm. And I think that's in part because the way she thought about caste also is inclined to do that a little bit too, that there isn't enough. There's not enough class in thinking about caste in India. But look, this analogy, I mean, Ambedkar, who was the leader of the Dalit movement, corresponded with Du Bois, and they talked about the parallels between the situations, and Du Bois thought that illuminating. So I'm not against, it's just that it's an analogy, and so you have to be careful that you know. In the philosophy of science, we say there are there's the sort of positive model, there's the features of the analogy that are true, it really is like that. There's the features that there's the negative analogy, there's the positive analogy, the negative analogy, and then there's the neutral analogy. There's the things where it might be helpful to use the model, but we don't yet know, right? When you use a model like caste for thinking about race, or class actually, there are some things you know from the start are in the negative analogy. You know that there are some disanalogies. How big and fruitful the neutral analogy is the question. And as I say, I think American sociology, especially as done by African American sociologists, has explored this analogy in very interesting ways. And she says that, she draws on it, she even talks about the lives of some of those people. So I'm not saying anything she doesn't know. Oh, I have some questions. Sorry, you contextualize racialism as universal qualities, yet as is evident in some of your examples, race and racism are historically and geographically specific. What are your thoughts, ideas about contesting specific racism in a way that bears the universal qualities that you've outlined in mind? Well,
Can you repeat that?
yes, sorry, I was actually...
Without your mask.
Oh, God, why did I put my mask? I put my mask back on, I don't know why. It's because I'm a good person. It's how you signal that these days. You contextualize racism and racialism as universal qualities. That is, I'm saying these are things you could find in lots of places, not just here and not just in the post Middle Passage Atlantic world. Yet, as is evident in some of your examples, race and racism are historically and geographically specific. What are your thoughts, ideas about contesting specific racism in a way that bears the universal qualities that you've outlined in mind? So I think, if I get the gist of the question, it's about, it's really connected with the issue of the positive and the negative analogies. The kind of racism that developed in apartheid South Africa, or the kind of racism that, as I said, first put the word into circulation with anti-Semitism in Europe and also anti-Roma and other racist attitudes. They had the features that I just said, but of course they were very particular. I mean, in the context of Europe, these Christian societies, anti-Judaist religious traditions, right? In the New Testament it says essentially that it's the Jews who mean that it's Christ and not Barabbas that is crucified, right? So Pontius Pilate offers the Jews the chance to redeem Christ. Of course, the whole redemption narrative wouldn't work if they accept, but still. And so throughout, in the Middle Ages and so on, people said about Jews, well, they're the ones who killed Christ, or Pontius Pilate was happy not to kill Christ, they said. It wasn't the Romans, and so on. So there are all these religious narratives against Jews that develop in the context of the Christian narrative which is all, about anxiety I think, connected with the fact that, of course, Christ is Jewish. So, and has to be, for narrative reasons, he has to be Jewish. He can't, if he's not in the line of David, he can't be the Messiah. All right. So, so there's that very specific thing. But one thing but I think what happens, and how anti-Judaism turns into anti-Semitism, and is much more about race and less about religion, is something that starts with the reconquest of Spain in 1492 and the expulsion of Muslims and Jews from the peninsula, the Iberian Peninsula. And if you wanted to stay, it was a condition of staying that you converted to Christianity. And among the conversos, therefore, were many Muslims and people of Muslim and Jewish tradition who converted in order not to be kicked out, and maybe some of them actually believed the new stuff, I don't know. And what happens is suspicion arises that beneath the surface of the conversos is an underlying, the person is still underlying really Muslim or Jewish. And so you get the beginnings of the idea that it's not the thoughts of Jewish people, it's not Judaism, the belief, that makes you Jewish. It's something, and they use the word, it's something in the blood. And so you, instead of thinking of Jews as people who have a certain confession, a certain faith, a certain set of beliefs and practices maybe, you start to think of them as people who have certain kinds of bodies. It's in the blood. And that idea that idea is used against Jewish people in Europe, first of all in Spain, but then more generally. And by the time an ideology is needed to rationalize Atlantic slavery, the idea that there could be something in the blood that characterizes you as inferior and also bad, perhaps, can be drawn on. And it's that makes that thought, which is a it's the racialist thought, that there's something in these people, in their bodies, there's some essence that explains why they're different from us and also explains why they're worse than us in some dimension, some morally relevant dimension. And I think, all right, so I don't know how much. So one question that is raised by this questioner is one can say things like that. One can talk about analogies and different. We could talk as well about structures like this in East Asia, which don't have very much derivation. Well, there's a connection between racism in East Asia and these Western ideas because the intellectuals who produced it in China and Japan were very much in dialogue with Western science. They were not happily working independently and in isolation from the scientific knowledge elsewhere. But still, there are sort of distinct traditions of othering that go on in other places. And if you're going to fight one of them, you do need to know the details of its you need to know, as the questioner says, its specificity. You can't fight against racism, as it were, in the abstract. You can't fight against the attitudes of Chinese people to some Southeast Asians and against the attitudes of some Americans to black people in the abstract. You need to fight against them where you are. And so the specific forms of racism against people of various kinds in various places need to be met through a detailed understanding of the ideology that's in that place. I mean, the Rwandan genocide was also a racist genocide. The racialization of the Tutsi, which unfortunately was, which was a colonial project, that the Belgians turned the people of that region into two races. Well, three, but mostly two, Hutu and Tutsi, and kind of separate thing. And they told a story about these races, that there's these noble, tall, lighter-skinned people who really come from the Horn of Africa, and these dark forest Bantu people who are shorter and darker and blacker and so on. And when the Belgians arrived, these people didn't know that they were two people with two kinds of racial histories, and that suggests that they weren't. But by the time the Belgians left, everybody had a T or an H on their IDs. And so, of course, once the state is seeing you through this racial lens, you get racialized, and then people can use politics to mobilize against one racial group against another in order to compete for resources. One of the central facts about Rwanda and Burundi, that area of the world, is that it's one of the most densely populated regions of the world, and competition for ecological space is very, very intense there. And so you need, when people are... One of the things that happens with racial and ethnic identities is that when there is a kind of serious competition for resources, people mobilize whatever ethnic and racial identities they can in order to organize that competition. This is what happened in the Yugoslavia after the end of the socialist period, the communist period. And identities that are not doing much harm, which they weren't in Yugoslavia, can quickly be mobilized to do terrible things, and basically racist things in the case of the attitudes of Serbs to Bosniak Muslims are basically racist. It's not really about Islam. It's just racism. I mean, on my understanding of what racism is. But you need to know the specific stories. The anti-Bosniak stuff and the stuff in the south of the Balkans involved knowing stories that Serbians tell about battles in the 14th century and stuff like that. So yeah, you have to respond to the specifics, I think. But that doesn't mean it isn't helpful to see this pattern everywhere. And one of the reasons it's helpful is because it means that Ambedkar and Du Bois can help each other think about their different situations. The analogies can be illuminating. And of course, Steve Biko, who was an important figure in the development of black consciousness in South Africa, was very much inspired by African American thinkers of the 60s. So, parallel situations, not identical situations, but noticing the parallels can allow you to work across societies together. And also it creates kind of natural emotional solidarities, right? I mean, one reason why African Americans were very prominent in the anti-apartheid movement was that they knew what it was like to be treated like that. And the racism of the South Africans was directed at them too, right? I mean, the South African state didn't have you under its control if you were an African American. But if it had you under its control, it would have treated you the way it treated other black people. So it implied, that system implied your inferiority just as much as it implied the inferiority of black people in South Africa. I mean, this is interesting to me because this phenomenon, I think, explains one of the very interesting historical features of the way in which abolition happened, abolition of the slave trade happened, which was that, as you know, the slave trade was abolished by a British act because the British had the most powerful navy in the world, and if they said there wasn't going to be ships crossing the Atlantic, they could stop it happening. And also their ships were very important in the slave trade, so if you made it illegal for British ships, you cut down the number of ships that could do it. So the slave trade goes on in the South Atlantic, but it doesn't, in the Northern Hemisphere, the British basically able to stop it in 1803. All right, why? There's no black people in Britain. Why is anybody agitating about this? I think that a good part of it, and especially a good part of the not anti-slave trade, but anti-slavery movement in Britain, in which, for the first time, working people played a significant part in British politics, was that they saw the enslavement of black people to do manual labor as an insult to them. Because what the American slavery system, I mean the Americas, not just the United States, slavery system said was, there's a kind of work that's demeaning, and so we only give it to black people. But that was the work they were doing in England. Right? They were the peasants. They were the people farming. They were doing the backbreaking industrial labor. And so they were white people, but they identified through their class with the because the system, what they saw in slavery wasn't the harm to black people, it was the insult to working people. And so when Frederick Douglass goes to England to campaign against slavery in the British Empire, he gets big audiences of white people. And that's, I think, a good part of what they were thinking. They were thinking, he's right. What they're doing over there suggests there's something wrong with us. So those sorts of analogies can really mobilize people, can get people to work across complicated, very different social structures, can nevertheless get them to work together. That's why, as I said, African Americans were able to be powerful figures in the anti-apartheid movement. Because it wasn't the same, and by the time the big anti-apartheid struggles are going on, of course, we've got the Civil Rights Act and so on, so the situation here is very different. But that sense of a structural analogy between our situations mobilizes us, gives us a sense of shared struggle, and allows us, therefore, and allows Du Bois to care about the struggle of the Dalits. So, I think, I don't know what time we're supposed to stop.
Are you tired?
Well, there's a question here. So these questions are coming from the people online. How might white people best call out racist behavior without devolving into ad hominem attack? Well, so ad hominem means against the person as opposed to against the argument, right? When you make an ad hominem argument, you're arguing you're saying something about the person rather than about the argument that they're making. But when someone's racist, it is about the person, or sometimes. And so you don't need to avoid ad hominem attacks. You can say to someone who's doing something racist, you're doing something bad. You are doing something bad. It's not that you're making a bad argument. And so argue, I have to deal with your argument. You're just doing a bad thing. And all I have to tell you is it's a bad thing and I'm against it, I think. But obviously, behind that question is the question of what most helpfully will get people to change their behavior, and maybe just calling them out isn't going to do it. Maybe sometimes a gentler approach will get you further than simply point to the badness of what someone is doing, and I think that's true. And especially, one kind of context in which white Americans can work against racism is, for better or worse, in their own families. And there you have the kind of potential, at least, to draw on the background of trust. But then you have to do it respectfully, in the kind of ways that we talk in families. Simply announcing that your grandfather's a racist and to his face is probably not going to do very much. But talking to him in a sort of, I don't know your grandfather, so I don't know what would work with your grandfather. But and I'm glad to say my English grandfather wasn't racist. So otherwise he would have opposed his daughter's marriage to my father. But so I think this is one of those cases where specificity matters. You need to know the person you're talking to and figure out what will work for them. I think one of the most powerful instruments of the dissolution of bigotry is a slow process, but it involves spending time with people of other kinds, and spending time not as inferior and superior, but as equals. Ideally, doing useful things together. So bringing your grandfather to come and manage the Little League, which is an interracial Little League, where you're not directly saying, we're going to turn you away from being a racist, Grandpa, but saying, look, here's this thing, and you're going to be working with these other respectable people, some of whom will be black, and the kids, some of them will be black, and it'll turn out that if you do this properly, you'll end up liking some of the black kids, and so on, and that sort of thing, where you spend time with people. So going at it indirectly is often easier and more effective. This is why, the great model here, of course, is the incredibly successful movement, the LGBT movement, especially the LG, the original sort of first phase, lesbians and gays, because the coming out agenda meant that more and more people were meeting every day with people they knew to be gay. Now, those people had been gay all along, but they didn't know. And so they didn't know they were hanging out with gay people, and they didn't know that they needed the help of this gay person who was helping them with their work, or that this gay person was the person who made the office work. It was just Joe. And then when Joe comes out, you think, I've been relying on Joe, and I can go on saying homophobic things, I suppose, but maybe I should shut up. And after a while, that process, leads people to be more comfortable around people that in the past they stigmatized and thought negatively about. But that requires, that's a very special kind of case, because of course the gay people were there all along, and all they had to do was a very brave thing to do, was to come out. But, so they were already, as it were, in positions of rough equality, and then they came out and so now you're in a position of rough equality with a gay person. Black and white people were not in positions of rough equality, and it wasn't enough of, it wasn't going to work for black people to say, oh, by the way, I'm black, so, and you've been relying on me all these years, so that mechanism wasn't going to work. But integrating institutions, like the armed services, the United States Armed Services, which not super popular on campuses, but the United States Armed Services is one of the great anti-racist institutions, because it takes in people from families that are like the ones I described, and it makes you, it's a total institution, so it can make you spend time with people that you start out being bigoted about. And after a while, you get to see that if there's a small number of people that really screws up, you're all dead. And so you come to rely on each other. And once you're relying on each other, then it gets harder for you to say and to think the negative things about people of the kinds represented. That's why allowing the American Armed Services, people in the American Armed Services come out was good. Because now you're relying on gay people if you're a soldier. And if you screw up with that, you'll all be dead, right? And so that sense of working together alongside one another. And the United States, of course, it's also a total institution, so they can also command people to do various things. They can force people to take orders from black officers and court-martial them if they disobey, and they can have, which we can't do outside, obviously. So I think that mechanism is hugely important, the mechanism of, and it's one of the things about colleges. Right? We need our colleges to be places where people work together across all kinds of identities on terms of rough equality, because that will allow us to get away from some of our prejudices. And all of us have some. So I think that's an important... So this, by the way, what I'm just saying is just an articulation of what psychologists call the contact hypothesis. So if you want to look it up, that's what it's called. It's the idea that the right kind of contact between people reduces prejudice. Maybe on that moderately hopeful note.